In 30 seconds, I would have to make the most dangerous decision of my life. And I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened. I was nobody. I was invisible. I was the kind of woman that powerful men looked right through as if I were made of glass. But in 30 seconds, everything I believed about myself would be proven wrong. A stranger with a hidden blade was walking toward the private dining room where the most powerful mafia boss in New York was having dinner. I was just a waitress, exhausted, invisible, and completely alone. If I stayed silent, a man would die tonight. If I warned him, I might die instead. But what I didn't know yet was that this single moment would change everything: my identity, my future, and the dark family secret that had been buried for generations. This is the story of how I saved a killer's life and ended up becoming his wife. But before you hear what happened next, let me tell you this. Some love stories don't begin with romance. They begin with blood, betrayal, and a choice that can never be undone. This story will show you that sometimes the most unexpected moments become the turning points that define our entire lives. True courage isn't about being fearless. It's about acting despite your fear. And sometimes the person who saves you isn't a prince on a white horse. Sometimes she's a tired waitress with ink on her palm and fire in her heart. If this story touches your heart, please like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Let me take you back to where it all began. To the moment when I was still just Julia Romano, a nobody from the Bronx who thought her biggest problem was paying rent on time. I had no idea that everything I knew about my life, my family, and my own identity was about to be shattered into a million pieces. By the 6th hour of my shift, the ache in my lower back was no longer a visitor, but a permanent resident. Every step I took across the polished marble floors of La Feniche sent a deep, pulsing pain through muscles that had long since forgotten the feeling of rest. I want you to imagine this with me. Imagine being so tired that your bones feel hollow. Imagine smiling at strangers who treat you like furniture while your feet scream for mercy. That was my life. That was every single night. The heavy scent of basil and simmering tomatoes was woven into the fabric of my uniform, a constant reminder of this place, mixed with the faint, sharp smell of expensive wine from an earlier spill. On my left arm, I balanced 3 heavy plates of ossobuco, weaving through a sea of tables occupied by men in suits that cost more than my entire month's rent, and women adorned with diamonds that sparkled under the crystal chandeliers. La Feniche was a world where I was only ever meant to be the help, and that was a lesson power teaches you every single day. If you want to know what happens next, you have to keep listening. The restaurant was a legend, nestled in a brownstone on Arthur Avenue, and owned by the Caruso family for 3 generations. It served as the unofficial court for every important Italian family in the Bronx and far beyond. The walls were a gallery of old Naples, filled with photos of weathered fishing boats and sun-drenched coastlines that my nonna Caterina would describe in bedtime stories. I was raised on those tales, on the musical rhythm of her Neapolitan dialect and the rich aroma of her Sunday ragu. Now, I served that very same food to strangers who looked right through me, their eyes fixed only on the plates I delivered. I had no idea that my grandmother had been keeping secrets from me my entire life. Secrets that would surface tonight and change everything. Julia, table 12 is ready for their check, and the private room just ordered another bottle of the Barolo. Marco, the floor manager, materialized at my side with his clipboard, his gaze scanning the dining room like a predator hunting for weakness. He was a compact man with a receding hairline and a constant film of sweat on his brow, the kind of person who fed on the anxiety of others. Also, there is a new man working tonight. Antonio called out sick, so the agency sent a replacement. You need to keep an eye on him. Make sure he does not become an embarrassment for us. I gave a slight nod, placing the plates of ossobuco at table 7 with an automatic smile before my eyes drifted toward the service station to find the new waiter. He was a big man, tall and broad, with dark hair cut extremely short and a rigid posture that suggested a military background, not a career in hospitality. His thick fingers seemed clumsy and awkward as he struggled with a wine opener. There was an unnerving stillness about him that made the small hairs on my neck rise in warning. It was a feeling I had learned to respect, a survival instinct sharpened by years of living in neighborhoods where you had to read people correctly or pay a painful price. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut the way you feel thunder before you hear it. The room was alive with the murmur of conversations in both Italian and English, punctuated by the delicate chime of wine glasses and the soft melody of a Puccini opera playing from unseen speakers. I navigated the floor like a phantom, refilling water glasses, clearing away finished plates, and anticipating the needs of guests before they even had to ask. This was a craft I had honed over 3 long years at La Feniche. The ability to be completely present yet entirely unseen, to serve without ever interrupting. My Nona would have admired my work ethic, though she would have grieved over the circumstances that brought me to this point. The Romano family had apparently been significant in Naples once, before the Great War scattered our people across the globe. Caterina used to tell me grand stories of sprawling homes and olive groves, of family alliances built over centuries, and debts of honor that were worth more than any amount of money. I had always dismissed them as comforting fantasies, the way elderly people romanticize the past to make the present poverty more bearable. Occasionally, however, when I was serving certain guests, those with ancient names and even older fortunes, I would see a flicker of recognition in their expressions, as if they were seeing the ghost of another face in mine. Tonight, the occupants of the private room were a group I had been warned about in hushed, nervous tones. Marco had called it the Duca table, his voice laced with a reverence that was indistinguishable from raw fear. Matteo Duca was not a man you read about in the papers or saw on television. He conducted his affairs from the shadows. His immense influence felt like a change in atmospheric pressure rather than seen with the eyes. His power was defined by the profound silence that would descend whenever he entered a space, not by any noise he made himself. I had never been assigned to serve him directly. That particular duty was always given to the most senior staff. But I had observed him from afar, taking note of how other powerful men would yield to him, how his quiet presence alone could alter the entire dynamic of a room. Near the kitchen entrance, the new waiter dropped a full tray of glasses, and the resulting crash sliced through the restaurant's ambient hum like a gunshot. I flinched, watching him hurry to pick up the broken shards, his motions awkward and panicked. Marco was instantly beside him, hissing sharp rebukes in a rapid Italian that the new man obviously could not understand. And that's when the second alarm went off in my head. What kind of staffing agency would dispatch a waiter who did not speak Italian to a place like La Feniche? After delivering the check to table 12 and gathering empty wine glasses from the bar, I found myself moving closer to the service station. The new man was there, pretending to straighten a stack of napkins. From this proximity, I could see the hard line of his jaw and the way his eyes kept darting toward the private room where Matteo Duca was seated with his men. His gaze was not the curious look of a civilian impressed by proximity to power. It was sharp, cold, and calculating, the intense focus of a hunter assessing his prey. A sudden chill traced its way down my spine, and it had nothing to do with the cool air. I positioned myself by the coffee machine, polishing glassware that was already spotless, observing the stranger out of the corner of my vision. His uniform jacket seemed to hang improperly on his left side, creating a subtle bulge that most would overlook. But I recognized it. I had grown up in the Bronx, and I knew boys who carried their own form of protection in their waistbands, and men who settled their arguments with steel instead of words. As he reached for more napkins, his sleeve slid up just enough to expose a glint of metal strapped tightly to his forearm. It was a knife, hidden beneath the cloth, placed for a quick, deadly draw. My hands started to tremble as I put down the glass I was holding, my mind racing through a list of terrible options. Should I get Marco? He would demand an explanation, wasting precious seconds doubting me. Should I call the police? They would never make it in time, and Lafaniche had certain arrangements with the authorities that made official help a very complicated matter. What about warning someone at Duca's table? I had no idea how they would react. Approaching them might be seen as a threat itself, not a warning. The man was on the move now, dropping his pretense of work and heading purposefully down the hallway that led directly to the private room. His right hand slid discreetly inside his jacket, his fingers wrapping around an object I could not see. Time seemed to shrink and stretch, each beat of my heart pounding in my ears, like a war drum. And in that moment I had to make a choice. I could stay silent and stay safe. I could pretend I saw nothing and go back to being invisible. Or I could do something that might get me killed. I snatched the heavy wine jug from the counter and a pen from my apron, scribbling a message across my palm with frantic urgency. The ink smudged against my sweaty skin, but the words were still clear enough to be read. They had to be. With a server's practiced smile locked onto my face, I walked toward the private room, projecting a confidence that was the complete opposite of the terror ripping through my chest. The stranger was just a few feet ahead of me, his pace accelerating, his deadly intention now perfectly clear. I hurried past him with a quick, muttered "scusi," making sure to enter the room before he could. I walked straight to the head of the table where Matteo Duca was seated. He glanced up as I came near, and I saw his face clearly for the very first time. He had a strong jawline covered in dark stubble, and intense, intelligent eyes that held a hard glint beneath their surface. His high cheekbones looked as if they were sculpted from marble. It was a face from a Renaissance masterpiece, breathtakingly beautiful and profoundly dangerous all at once. His dark hair was styled back from his forehead, a silver watch shone on his wrist, and his tailored shirt was unbuttoned just enough to show a simple gold chain against his olive skin. With my left hand, I raised the wine jug and began to pour, deliberately positioning my body so my open right palm was facing him. The hastily written message on my skin was visible only to him. It read, "Fake waiter, you are the target tonight. Run." His dark gaze lowered to my hand, and I watched as understanding dawned in his expression without a single flicker of emotion. His eyes did not widen, he did not gasp for air, there was absolutely no sign of alarm. He simply absorbed the words on my skin, and then his eyes met mine again with a force that stole the air from my lungs. For 3 seconds that felt like an eternity, we held each other's gaze. I was a complete stranger who had just gambled everything to warn a man I did not know, and he was a man whose life now rested on the word of a waitress he had never even seen before. In that brief moment, an unspoken understanding passed between us, a mutual recognition of courage that existed outside of our stations in life. Then, Matteo Duca calmly reached for his napkin, dabbed at his lips with practiced elegance, and stood up from his chair as if he had just recalled an urgent phone call he needed to make. He spoke briefly to his associates in a dialect that was too rapid for me to understand. And then he was walking toward the side exit, his steps calm and unhurried, even as death itself had been approaching him. I kept pouring wine for the other men at the table, my hands miraculously steady now that the danger had passed. My heart, however, was hammering against my ribs hard enough to shatter them. From behind me, I heard the stranger let out a quiet curse. I heard the sound of shuffling feet as he realized his intended victim was gone. I heard Marco's voice, full of confusion, asking why the private party had ended so abruptly. The immediate crisis was over. But as I finally finished my rounds and escaped to the kitchen to steady my breathing, I knew with absolute certainty that something had not just ended, it had just begun. The rest of my shift was a complete haze of robotic motions and fake smiles, my body on autopilot while my mind kept replaying those 3 critical seconds over and over again. Those few seconds played over and over in my head. The true weight of my actions settled on me like a slow, heavy snow. Each minute added another layer of understanding until the pressure became unbearable. I had tipped off a Mafia boss about an attempt on his life. I had inserted myself into a world that was not my own, a place where debts were settled with violence and favors had costs I could not even begin to comprehend. But what choice did I have? What kind of person stands by and watches a man die when they have the power to stop it? The stranger had vanished soon after Matteo departed, slipping away through the kitchen as Marco dealt with the abrupt chaos caused by the private party leaving. No one even mentioned that he was gone. Agency staff were always in and out, their faces blurring together in the constant flow of restaurant workers. But I would not forget his face, or the cold calculation in his eyes, or the way his hand had drifted toward the hidden knife. I would always remember and think about how close I had come to seeing something truly terrible. When I finally clocked out at 11 o'clock, my feet were throbbing, and my uniform was saturated with the smells of garlic and exhaustion. The October night had grown cold, and a biting wind sliced right through the light jacket I had put on that morning, when the air still carried a hint of autumn's warmth. I shoved open the side door and stepped into the alley, my mind already mapping out the subway trip home. I was already doing the math on how many hours of sleep I could possibly get before my morning class at the community college. But what I saw next stopped me dead in my tracks. A black car was idling at the alley's entrance. It was polished and expensive, the type of car you see in films about powerful men and the women who are foolish enough to fall for them. Its engine was a low, steady hum that suggested German precision and Italian style. The windows were tinted so darkly that it was impossible to see who was inside. My hand clenched the strap of my bag as every single instinct screamed at me to turn back, to find a different way out, to act like I had never seen it. But before I could move, the rear door swung open. Matteo Duca stepped out. He had removed his jacket, and his white shirt seemed to glow in the dim light of the alley. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, exposing strong forearms and a glimpse of a dark tattoo that snaked across his wrist. He looked at me with the same intense focus I remembered from the private room, that sensation of being truly seen for the very first time. "Miss Romano," he said. His voice was deeper than I expected, rich and accented. "I believe we have something to discuss." The urge to run and the urge to stay fought for control of my limbs. Curiosity won, along with a foolish sense of pride that refused to show fear. I do not believe in fate, neither did I. He did not follow me. He did not press the issue. Until tonight. A door creaked open somewhere behind me. The sound of voices floated into the night as other employees began to leave. The strange spell was broken, and I was suddenly aware of how visible we were, how easily this entire scene could be misread by anyone passing by. "I have to go," I said, turning to leave. "Julia." Hearing my name stopped me better than any wall could have. "The man they sent for me tonight will not be the last one. They already know you warned me. They have spies everywhere, watching and waiting. You are no longer safe." I should have been filled with terror. Instead, a strange sense of calm washed over me, as if some part of my soul had been expecting this, getting ready for it, without ever realizing it. "I have never been safe," I told him quietly. "That part is not new." "Then let me provide something that is," he said, extending the card to me once more. "Protection. With no strings attached, no hidden obligations, just the certainty that someone is watching over you. Why would you do that for a total stranger?" His smile was faint, almost sorrowful. "Because my grandfather would have insisted on it. Because a Romano saved his life a very long time ago, and a Duca always repays his debts." He placed the card into my palm, and his fingers felt warm against my freezing skin. "Think it over. And when you decide you are ready to talk, use that number anytime, day or night." Before I could even think of a reply, he was getting back into the car. The door shut with the muted, solid sound of expensive engineering. The engine purred, and then he was simply gone. The car's taillights vanished around the block, leaving me standing all alone in the freezing October night. A business card felt like it was burning a hole in my hand, and questions were multiplying in my mind faster than I could possibly answer them. I did not call him that night, or the next, or the one after, but I held on to the card. And with every walk to my job, every ride home on the subway, every single night I spent awake in my small apartment, listening to the city's endless noise, I felt unseen eyes on me. They had not been there before. Watching, waiting. I had no idea if they were Mateo's men or the enemies he had told me about. I could not be sure. The only thing I knew for certain was that my entire life had been transformed in the 3 seconds it took to write a message on my hand. There was no way to return to the person I was before, but what happened next would prove that the danger had only just begun. 3 whole weeks passed until I saw him again. My days had started to feel strange. Normal routines were now broken by sudden moments of intense awareness that left me completely drained. I began to see things I had never noticed in the past. The same car was parked on the street across from my apartment building for 2 days straight. A man loitered for far too long near the subway station entrance. I felt the undeniable weight of being watched, even when I could not see who was doing it. Mateo had told me that I was not safe anymore, and even though I had initially thought his words were just for dramatic effect, the slow creep of reality was starting to prove him right. My apartment had been broken into while I was away at class. Nothing of value was missing. I did not own anything worth stealing. But my drawers had been pulled open, papers were moved around, and the neat order of my belongings had been disturbed. Someone had moved my grandmother's pictures. The search of my apartment was the work of professionals. They left behind no prints, no sign of forced entry, nothing that would let me go to the police without sounding insane. Still, the violation was a cold certainty deep in my bones. I was overwhelmed by the thought that strangers had handled my possessions, inhaled the air in my home, occupied my personal space. That evening, I finally worked up the nerve to dial the number on the business card. He was there in less than 60 minutes. The rap on my door was quiet, almost hesitant, a stark contrast to the aggressive break-in I had braced myself for. When I pulled the door open, Mateo was there in the cramped hallway. He seemed like a figure from another world, his expensive coat and polished shoes clashing with the scene of my peeling paint and stuttering overhead lights. His face remained perfectly composed, but I saw a flicker of something in his gaze as he took in my expression, perceiving the terror I was trying so hard to conceal. He asked quietly, "May I come in?" I moved out of the way, allowing him inside the apartment, which immediately felt more cramped and run down with him in it. He made no mention of the discolored patch on the ceiling from a leak, nor the worn-out furniture or the empty walls I had never gotten around to decorating. Instead, his eyes scanned the entire room with a practiced, methodical precision, identifying every possible entrance, line of sight, and security weakness. "When did they do this?" he inquired, though his tone suggested he already knew the nature of my answer. "Today. It happened while I was at my classes." I hugged my arms to my chest, a sudden chill running through me that the clanking radiator could not warm. They searched through all of it, my grandmother's old letters, the photos, they even looked at my school notebooks. My voice broke as I finished, and a wave of shame washed over me for showing such vulnerability. What reason could they have for this? "They are searching for leverage," he stated. He pivoted to look directly at me, and for the first time, I could see real fury in his eyes. It was not the icy, detached anger I expected, but a raw, personal fire. "They want something to hold over your head if you start to become an issue. Proof of any secrets, any affiliations, anything at all that could make you weak." He stopped talking for a moment, his eyes examining my face. "Did your Nona leave anything for you? Any papers, correspondence, or items from Italy?" His question was unexpected. Only her jewelry box and a few old pictures. Nothing of any real value. Could I look at them? There was a quality in his voice that gave me a moment's pause, but I guided him toward the little wooden chest on my dresser. It was intricately carved with flowers, the same box my grandmother brought with her from Naples when she came to this country at just 17 years old. I lifted the lid, showing him the simple collection inside. A necklace made of glass beads, a silver ring dark with age, and a faded picture of a young woman posing in front of an unfamiliar grand house. Matteo lifted the photograph with a delicate, almost reverent touch. He angled it toward the light, seeming to scan the sepia-toned image for some concealed meaning. I saw his expression shift. It was a subtle change, but absolutely clear. There was recognition, then astonishment, and finally something more profound that I could not identify. "Do you have any idea what you have here?" he asked, his voice sounding unusually hoarse. I just shook my head. My Nonna never spoke about her past in Italy. She shared anecdotes, but never once mentioned her relatives or the reasons she came here. I just figured the memories were too painful for her. He placed the picture back down with care, his fingertips hesitating on the photograph's edge. "This house," he began, "it was owned by my family, 3 generations back, before the war." He paused again. "And this woman in the picture." He stopped speaking and met my gaze, and I saw a new emotion in his eyes. It was an intensity that made my heart hammer against my ribs. She was my great-grandmother's dearest friend. Her name was Caterina Romano. She was your grandmother. It took a few seconds for his words to register. When they finally did, the entire apartment felt like it was spinning. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about my grandmother, about who I was. It was all built on a secret that stretched back almost a century, a secret that had been waiting for me to discover it. "That cannot be true. Read what is written on the back," he urged. With shaking hands, I took the photograph and flipped it over. Written there in ink that had faded over time was a short line of Italian that I had never seen before. "Per insieme al fine. C.R. Napoli, 1938. Forever together until the end," Matteo translated softly. "C.R. and L.D. Lucia Duca. That was my Nonna's mother. She and your grandmother were as close as sisters. When the war started and their families were forced to flee, they made a vow to always look after one another's children, regardless of where life took them." I collapsed onto the side of my mattress, the photograph held tightly in my grip. I struggled to make sense of this new information, to fit it into the story of my family that I had always accepted. My grandmother had never once spoken of the Ducas, or given any clue about a bond that stretched back through generations. She filled my childhood with tales of Naples, but she always spoke of it like a faraway legend, not as a part of our living history that could one day resurface and find me. "Why did she never tell me?" I asked in a near whisper. Matteo moved to sit next to me on the bed. He was not quite touching me, but he was so near that I could sense the heat from his presence. "Maybe she was trying to shield you." The Duca family name acquired a darker meaning as time went on. It's possible she believed that your ignorance would be your protection from the life she had managed to leave behind. My mind flashed back to my Nonna's expression when I first told her I was working at La Fenice. I remembered the peculiar look that briefly crossed her face before she forced a smile and offered her congratulations. Could she have known? Is it possible she feared that my job at that specific restaurant would inevitably lead me to the very family she worked so hard to stay away from? "This changes nothing," I declared, though I was trying to convince myself more than I was trying to convince him. "It changes absolutely everything," he responded, his tone soft but resolute. "You saved my life, Julia. And now I finally know the reason. It wasn't just chance, or good fortune, or even your own bravery, which you clearly possess. It was something far more ancient, more profound. It was the connection our families share, echoing through the generations and demanding its due." The sheer force of his stare made it difficult to draw a breath. I had to turn away, fixing my eyes on the photograph, on the faces of those 2 young women who experienced life, love, and loss in a time and place now gone forever. Tell me more about her, I requested. Tell me about Lucia Duca and about the bond they had. And so he began to speak. For the next several hours, we sat together in my small apartment as Matteo painted a picture of Naples in the years before the war. He told me about two powerful families that created their fortunes together, and about the deep affection between Caterina and Lucia, a connection that was stronger than any tie of family or marriage. He described his great-grandmother with a gentleness that caught me by surprise, showing a layer of sensitivity beneath his formidable appearance that I never would have guessed was there. I listened intently, posing questions, and slowly piecing together the parts of a family history I never realized was mine. When he eventually concluded his story, the pale gray light of early morning was just beginning to filter through my window. We had stayed up talking for the whole night, and in that time, the terror that had compelled me to contact him had somehow, miraculously, morphed into a completely different feeling. "You need to get some rest," he said, getting up from the bed with a slight stiffness that showed he was just as tired. "I will post a man to keep an eye on this building. No one will bother you again." I escorted him to the entrance, feeling a sudden unwillingness for him to leave. "Matteo." Saying his name aloud felt unfamiliar, carrying an intimacy I had not meant to convey. "So what comes next?" He pivoted in the doorway, his features partially obscured by shadows. "Now, we pay respect to the pact our grandmothers made. My duty is to protect you, for their sake, and for the kind of man I aspire to become." He lifted his hand and with incredible softness, he swept a loose strand of hair away from my cheek. "And maybe, if you are open to it, we can explore what other legacies our families may have left behind for us." He departed before I had a chance to reply, leaving me alone in the entryway with the fragrance of his cologne still hanging in the air, and the old photograph held close to my chest. He returned the following evening, and the evening after that one as well. He always arrived at the same hour, right after the sun went down, as the city shifted from the stark reality of daylight into a gentler, more forgiving atmosphere. He never gave any warning of his visits or telephoned in advance. He would just materialize at my doorstep holding coffee from the Italian pastry shop on Arthur Avenue, or sweets bundled in wax paper. They were simple gifts, yet they felt immense because of the care behind them. We would sit together at my little table or out on the fire escape that looked down on the street below, discussing all manner of things, slowly creating a connection that I could not yet define. Matteo was entirely different from the man I had imagined. The tales that circulated about him, the hushed warnings from my colleagues, and the deliberate, careful advice from Marco all described a person of merciless strategy. They spoke of a man who used violence without hesitation and had fought his way to the top over the ambitions of his rivals. It was possible those accounts were accurate. At times, I caught sight of that other person in the detached precision he used when giving commands over his phone, or in the manner his men yielded to him with a reverence that was almost indistinguishable from fear. Yet there was a different Matteo who revealed himself only during the peaceful moments we shared. He could recite Dante by heart, his accent growing more pronounced with feeling as he spoke the verses his grandmother had shown him. He would laugh at my failed efforts to make my Nona's old recipes, before rolling up his own sleeves to demonstrate the correct technique, his hands moving with a skill that hinted at an unknown life at home. He would pay close attention when I spoke of my hopes to one day start a small enterprise, to create something that belonged only to me. And he would pose questions that demonstrated a genuine interest in what I had to say. "Why did you remain in this world?" I asked him one night, as we observed the setting sun casting hues of gold and amber across the Bronx. "You are smart, you have an education, you had the ability to do anything you wanted." He remained silent for a considerable time, gazing toward the horizon with a look on his face that I found impossible to decipher. "Because this is my identity," he eventually answered. "My family created something of importance here, something that serves our people, even when the outside world labels it as criminal activity. We offer protection to individuals who have nobody else to turn to. We resolve conflicts that law enforcement chooses to overlook. We are the ones people seek out when the established system lets them down. And what about the violence? I asked. His jaw clenched. It is a regrettable necessity. I take no pleasure in it, Julia. Every life that I have ended is a burden I carry. The people who had it coming. However, in the world I lived in, mercy was just another word for weakness, and getting weak meant getting killed. He shifted to look at me directly, his gaze filled with a brutal honesty that was almost painful. I will not pretend I am something I am not. This is who I am. I am a man who does monstrous things to keep the people I love safe. If that makes you afraid, I can understand that. It should have terrified me. Logically, every part of my mind was screaming that I was dancing with a consuming fire. This connection between us could only lead to absolute ruin. Yet when I looked at Matteo, I did not see a monster. I saw a man who was forged by a life he never asked for, a man carrying burdens that would have crushed a lesser person. He was a man struggling to keep his honor in a place that rewarded corruption. I am not afraid of you, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The wave of relief that washed over his features was so complete, so genuine, that it made my own heart ache. He reached out for my hand, his fingers weaving through mine in a way that felt both brand new and impossibly ancient, like our hands were finding each other after lifetimes apart. My grandfather always said that you measure a man by the woman who chooses to stand with him, he said quietly, his voice a low murmur. I never truly grasped his meaning until this very moment. That instant between us was heavy, filled with both immense possibility and profound danger. I knew exactly what was coming next. I could feel the tension building, like the heavy air right before a thunderstorm breaks. And for the very first time in my entire life, I did not run away from it. His kiss began softly, more of a question than a demand. His lips met mine with an unbelievable tenderness, allowing me every chance to pull back, to pick safety over this rising desire. But I did not. I leaned into him, answering his unspoken question with my own. In that instant, something changed between us. The kiss became deeper, his hand moving to gently cradle my face as his other arm pulled me closer against him. For a single flawless moment, my whole world shrank to the taste of his lips and the solid feel of him. It was the impossible sensation of being in the one place I was always meant to be. Have you ever experienced a moment so perfect that you know, with absolute certainty, that your life will forever be divided into before and after? This was my after. This was the moment when Julia Romano, the invisible waitress from the Bronx, ceased to exist, and someone new took her place. When we at last pulled apart, both of us breathing far more heavily than we should have been, he rested his forehead against my own. I have been alone for a very long time, he whispered. Not because of circumstance, but because I chose it. In my line of work, attachments are a liability. To love someone is to give your enemies a weapon they can use directly against you. His thumb gently traced the line of my jaw, and a shiver went through me despite the evening's warmth. But when I am with you, I cannot seem to recall why any of that was important. Maybe it does not have to be important, I found myself saying. Perhaps some risks are the only ones worth taking. His laugh was soft, with a hint of sadness in it. You sound just like your grandmother. My Nano always said she was the most courageous woman he had ever known, someone foolish enough to have faith in love inside a world built to crush it. And was she correct? Did their love manage to survive? She passed away in your grandmother's arms, he explained, the words seeming to get stuck in his throat. After the war, and after losing everything, they reconnected here in America and lived out their last years together. My entire family believed Lucia had gone mad when she decided to leave our family compound to go live with that Romano woman in the Bronx. But I believe she was simply remembering what was truly important. The thought of them, two elderly women who had endured a war, terrible loss, and decades of being apart, finally finding each other at the end of their lives, brought tears to my eyes. Now I understood. I finally knew why my Nana never talked about the Dukas, why that entire chapter of her life remained a secret. The agony of having lost Lucia would have been too much for her to revisit. Those memories were far too precious to be shared with anyone who had not been there to live them. They would be happy, I said in a soft voice, knowing that we have found one another. Matteo drew me in close, his arms wrapping around me as if to protect me from everything that existed outside of this single moment. No, they would tell us that we are fools, he gently corrected me, and they would not be wrong. This is a dangerous path, Julia. Being with me makes you a target. There is already a target on my back, I reminded him gently. At least this way, I am not facing that danger all by myself. We remained on that fire escape until the first stars appeared in the night sky, discussing the new future we were carefully trying to construct from the wreckage of our individual pasts. He spoke of his strategies to move more of his family's enterprises into the legitimate world, to bring their empire out from the shadows. I spoke of my aspirations to graduate from college, to show that a Romano could be successful without depending on anyone else's power. Neither of us brought up the glaring challenges, the enemies who wanted him dead, the society that would never approve of our connection, and the peril that now shadowed both of our lives. Just for one evening, we gave ourselves permission to believe that love could conquer all. We would soon discover it could not. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. I need you to understand something. Up until this moment, I had convinced myself that I could handle whatever came my way. I had survived losing my parents at 7. I had survived poverty. I had survived being invisible in a world that only valued the beautiful and the wealthy. But what happened next broke me in ways I never knew I could break. And if you think you know where this story is going, I promise you, you don't. The first blow came not from his enemies, but from his own world. It happened 2 weeks after our first kiss, at a charity gala Matteo had insisted I attend with him. I had borrowed a dress, a simple black gown that made me feel like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. I had spent 3 hours on my hair and makeup, trying to transform myself into someone who belonged in his world, someone worthy of standing beside him. And for one perfect hour, I almost believed I had succeeded. Matteo had looked at me like I was the most beautiful woman in the room. He had kept his hand on the small of my back, introducing me to people whose names I would never remember, whose wealth I could never comprehend. He had whispered in my ear that he could not wait to get me alone. He had made me feel, for the first time in my life, like I was not invisible. Then she walked in, and everything changed. Her name was Isabella Martinelli, and the moment I saw her, I understood what real beauty looked like. She was tall, with raven hair that cascaded down her back like black silk. Her red dress clung to curves that belonged on a magazine cover. Diamonds dripped from her ears and throat, catching the light with every graceful movement. She moved through the crowd like a queen surveying her subjects, and everyone parted to let her pass. Men stared, women whispered, and she seemed completely oblivious to it all, as if this kind of attention was simply her birthright. I felt my borrowed dress suddenly seem cheap. My carefully styled hair felt like a child's attempt at sophistication. Every insecurity I had ever buried came rushing back to the surface, threatening to drown me. But it was not her beauty that made my blood run cold. It was the way she walked directly toward Matteo, the way she placed her manicured hand on his arm with the familiarity of ownership, the way she leaned in and kissed his cheek, her red lips leaving a mark I could see from across the room, and the way his body seemed to relax at her touch, as if returning to something comfortable and familiar. "Matteo, darling," she purred, "it has been far too long." I watched Matteo's face carefully, searching for any sign of discomfort. Instead, I saw something that made my stomach drop. He smiled at her. A real smile, the kind I thought he reserved only for me. "Isabella," he said, "I did not know you would be here tonight. My mother insisted." She gestured vaguely toward an elegant older woman watching from across the room. You know how she feels about the alliance between our families. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that I could still hear. And you know how I feel about you. The room suddenly felt too hot, too crowded. I watched as they talked, their heads close together, their body language speaking of a history I knew nothing about. No one had told me about Isabella Martinelli. No one had mentioned that Matteo had been promised to another woman since childhood, that their families had been planning a merger of empires for decades, that I was nothing more than a temporary distraction in a game I did not even know was being played. I fled to the bathroom, locking myself in a stall and pressing my forehead against the cool tile. My breath came in short gasps that I struggled to control. How could I have been so stupid? How could I have believed that a man like Matteo Duca would choose a waitress from the Bronx over the daughter of one of the most powerful families in New York? I had seen the way powerful men operate. I had served them for 3 years, watched their casual cruelty, witnessed how they used people and discarded them when they were no longer useful. Had I really thought Matteo was different? Had I really thought I was special? The tears came then, hot and shameful. I had promised myself years ago that I would never cry over a man, that I would never let anyone have that kind of power over me. And here I was, sobbing in a bathroom stall at a charity gala, my borrowed dress suddenly feeling like a costume, my fairy tale turning into a nightmare. The door opened, and I heard the click of expensive heels on marble. "I know you are in here," a voice said. Isabella's voice, smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. I held my breath, hoping she would leave, but of course she did not. "You can come out, little waitress. I just want to talk." Her voice was sickly sweet, like poison coated in honey. Against every instinct, I unlocked the stall and stepped out. I would not cower. I would not hide. If she wanted a confrontation, she would get one. But on my terms. I walked to the sink and began washing my hands, taking my time, refusing to look at her. Isabella was leaning against the counter, examining her perfect reflection in the mirror. She looked like a painting come to life, a masterpiece of breeding and wealth and careful cultivation. Next to her, I felt like a rough sketch done by a child. She did not even look at me when she started speaking. "He does this, you know," she said conversationally, as if we were old friends catching up. "Finds little projects. Broken birds he thinks he can fix. There was a girl before you, a dancer from some club in Brooklyn. Before her, a teacher from Staten Island. He gets bored with his life, with the violence and the blood and the weight of his responsibilities. So he finds someone ordinary, someone simple, and he plays at being normal for a while." She finally turned, her dark eyes cold as ice, utterly devoid of warmth or mercy. "But he always comes back to me. Always. Because I am the only one who belongs in his world. I am the only one who understands what it means to be a duca. I am the only one his family will ever accept." Her words were designed to cut, and they did. But somewhere beneath the pain, I felt something else rising. That stubborn Romano pride my grandmother had instilled in me. "If he always comes back to you," I said, keeping my voice steady, "then why are you in here warning me off?" For the first time, something flickered in her perfect composure. "Because I do not like to share," she hissed, "and I do not like complications." She stepped closer, her perfume overwhelming. "Walk away, little waitress. Go back to your restaurant and your pathetic little life. Matteo and I are inevitable. Our families decided that decades ago. You are just a footnote in a story that was written long before you were born." She left before I could respond, leaving me alone with her words echoing in my head. When I finally emerged from the bathroom, Matteo was waiting in the hallway. His face was tight with concern. "Julia, what happened? Where did you go?" I looked at him, this man I was falling for despite every warning, and I realized I had a choice to make. I could believe Isabella's poison, run away, and spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. or I could trust what I saw in his eyes every time he looked at me. "Who is Isabella Martinelli to you?" I asked directly. His expression flickered with something that looked like guilt. "She is someone from my past, someone my family wanted me to marry." "Wanted?" I pressed. "Or wants?" He was silent for a long moment. "Our families have had an understanding for many years, but I never agreed to it. I never wanted her." "Then why did you smile at her like that?" I demanded. "Why did you let her kiss you?" "Because in my world, you do not make enemies unless you have to." He reached for my hand, and I let him take it despite my better judgment. "Isabella is dangerous, Julia. Her family is powerful. If I had publicly rejected her tonight, it would have started a war my people are not ready to fight. So I am just supposed to accept being your secret, while she parades around as your future wife?" "No." His grip on my hand tightened. "You are not a secret. You are the woman I have chosen. But I need time to do this correctly, to untangle myself from obligations I never made without getting everyone I love killed." He cupped my face in his hands. "Can you trust me? Can you give me time?" I should have said no. I should have walked away right then, before I was in too deep. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw the same fear I felt. The fear of losing something precious before it ever had a chance to grow. "Okay," I whispered. "I will trust you." It was the most dangerous promise I had ever made, and I had no idea how much it would cost me. For 3 beautiful weeks, everything seemed perfect. Matteo visited me every night. He brought me flowers and books and small gifts that showed he was paying attention to the things I said. He held me on the fire escape as the city sparkled below us. He made me feel seen in a way no one ever had before. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could make this work. Then everything fell apart. The assault happened on a Tuesday evening. I was returning home from the subway, my bag filled with heavy textbooks, my thoughts focused on a big exam coming up. The street was calm, the kind of autumn evening in the Bronx that felt almost serene. Dried leaves skittered on the sidewalk, sounding like quiet whispers. I did not even see the van until it slowed down beside me. I did not recognize the threat until its side door slid open with a harsh sound and strong hands reached out, dragging me violently inside. I fought back. My grandmother had made sure I knew how to fight. She ensured I could throw a solid punch and knew how to break someone's grip. These were lessons I had once thought were pointless, right up until that second. I scratched at the arms that held me tight. I screamed with all the force my lungs could produce, twisting and kicking with every ounce of strength I had. But there were too many of them. They were stronger, and far too experienced in this exact type of brutality. A cloth was shoved over my mouth and nose, a sharp chemical smell filled my senses, and then my world went completely black. When I came to, I was inside a warehouse. Overhead industrial lights cast stark shadows on concrete floors that were stained with things I did not want to name. My hands were tied tightly behind my back, the rope cutting into my skin, and a throbbing pain pounded in my head from the drug they used to knock me out. 3 men stood nearby, talking in Russian. It was a language I could not understand, but I knew it from movies and the times I had seen them making deliveries at La Fenice. One of them saw that I was conscious and spoke to the others. Their laughter was a sound that turned my blood to ice. "The Duca's little prize," one of them said, his English thick with an accent. "Now we will find out just how much he is willing to pay to have her returned." Cold fear tried to choke me, but something else rose up from underneath it. It was anger. It was pure defiance, that stubborn Romano pride my grandmother had taught me, right alongside how to fight. I refused to give them the satisfaction of watching me break. "He will not pay you a thing," I said, my voice sounding much stronger than I felt. "I mean nothing to him." The man who had spoken before crouched down in front of me. His face was uncomfortably close, and his breath smelled of stale, cheap alcohol. "We have been watching you, little girl. We see him visit your apartment building. We see him kiss you on that fire escape like some teenage boy in love. A man like Matteo Duca does not kiss a woman he feels nothing for. His smile was pure cruelty. He will pay us, or we will send you back to him in many small pieces. I want you to remember this moment, because what happened next taught me something about love that I will never forget. It taught me that real love is not about grand gestures or pretty words. Real love is about what someone is willing to risk when everything is on the line. The warehouse door suddenly burst open with a deafening crash. The next few moments were a blur of violent images that my mind could barely register. Men swarmed through the doorway, moving with the efficiency of trained soldiers. The sound of gunshots exploded against the concrete walls. Men were dropping to the ground, and standing in the middle of the chaos was Matteo. His face was a frozen mask of absolute rage, a look I had never seen before and prayed I would never see again. He eliminated the man who had threatened me without a moment of hesitation, without a trace of mercy. Then he was there, cutting the ropes from my wrists, pulling me tightly against his chest, and whispering words in Italian I was too dazed to comprehend. His hands moved quickly all over me, checking to make sure I was not injured, his touch a strange mix of gentleness and desperation. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. "Did they hurt you?" "I am okay." The words came out as a broken sob. "I am okay, Matteo. I am okay." He lifted me from the ground and carried me out of that warehouse as if I weighed nothing at all. We went past the bodies of the men who had grabbed me, past his own men who respectfully looked away. A car was waiting for us outside with the engine running, and he gently placed me into the back seat with a tenderness that was a violent contrast to the scene he had just created. We drove in complete silence. I pressed myself into his side, shaking from the shock that was finally hitting me, while he continuously stroked my hair in a calming, steady rhythm. When we pulled up to his compound, a massive, fortress-like house in Westchester I had only ever seen from the road, he carried me all the way inside. He did not put me down until we were in a guest bedroom, decorated in soothing blues and creams. "You are safe now," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "They will not ever touch you again. I swear that on my grandfather's grave." "How did you know where I was?" "The tracker." He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to my forehead. "The day after your apartment was broken into, I had a small tracker sewn into the lining of your coat. I know I should have told you about it, but I knew you would say no." His jaw was clenched tight. "If I had arrived just 5 minutes later, you were not late." I lifted my hand to his face, feeling the rigid tension just under his skin. "You came for me. I will always come for you." The sheer power in his voice was almost overwhelming. "Do you understand me, Julia? No matter what it costs, no matter what I must do, you are now mine to protect." The possessiveness in his declaration should have set off alarms, but instead, it calmed a place deep inside me, filling an emptiness I had not even realized was there. In that second, surrounded by proof of his incredible power and capacity for violence, I truly understood what it felt like to be loved by a man like Matteo Duca. It meant he would protect me, no matter the price. It meant being cherished as if I were something priceless. And it meant I had to accept that the very hands that held me with such tenderness could also commit terrible acts to keep me safe. "I am not going anywhere," I told him softly. "Not ever again." The relief that flooded his expression was powerful enough to shatter hearts. He drew me in close and I hid my face against his chest, breathing in the smell of him, a mix of gunpowder and expensive cologne, a scent of violence and affection all woven together. We remained like that for what felt like an eternity. We were two souls, tied together by a violent history, and a new, delicate connection that was forming between us, against all logic and reason. "Marry me," he whispered, his voice muffled by my hair. I pulled away from him, my eyes searching his for any sign of a joke. I found nothing. His face was completely serious, showing a raw vulnerability that I was certain very few people had ever been allowed to see. "Matteo, Not today, I told him, and not tomorrow, but someday. When all of this is finished, when I know I have made this world safe enough for you to exist in it without fear. His hands came up to cup my face, his thumbs gently brushing away tears that I had not even felt fall. Tell me you will marry me, Giulia Romano. Tell me you will be my wife, my partner in everything, and the mother of my children. Promise you will stand with me until the very end. His words seemed to twist and echo in my thoughts, blending with the writing on that aged photograph. Per sempre, fino alla fine, forever together until the end. Yes, I breathed out. Yes, Matteo. Yes. The kiss he gave me was a mix of salvation and pure danger, a combination of everything I had ever been afraid of and everything I had ever desired. As he held me close in that room, bathed in a soft blue glow, I understood that no matter what was coming, we would meet it as one. Two families were finally being brought back together after generations of separation. Two hearts had managed to find one another through time and terrible loss. The rest of the world might call us completely insane. It might even try to tear us apart. But we were a Romano and a Duca, the inheritors of a love that had endured war, loss, and many decades of complete silence. We would get through this as well. And we did. Against every odd, against every enemy, against every force that tried to tear us apart. We did. But the hardest test was still coming, and it would come from the person I least expected. The betrayal happened 3 days before our wedding. I was at my fitting for the wedding dress when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It contained only an address and 3 words. He is lying. Every instinct told me to ignore it, to trust Matteo, to believe in what we had built together. We had survived so much already. The kidnapping, the threats, the constant shadow of danger that followed us everywhere. Why would I doubt him now, 3 days before we were supposed to become husband and wife? But something made me go. Call it intuition. Call it the survival instinct that had kept me alive in the Bronx all those years. Call it the voice of my grandmother, whispering from beyond the grave that some truths cannot be avoided, only delayed. I told Matteo I had forgotten something at the bakery. I drove to that address, a small coffee shop in Brooklyn I had never seen before, my hands trembling on the steering wheel the entire way. She was waiting for me. Not Isabella. Someone worse. Someone I had trusted completely. It was Rosa, Matteo's cousin. The woman who had welcomed me into the family with open arms when others had looked at me with suspicion and contempt. The woman who had helped me plan my wedding, spending hours poring over flower arrangements and seating charts. The woman who had become my first real friend in this new, dangerous world. I am sorry, Giulia, she said, her eyes red from crying, but you deserve to know the truth before it is too late. The truth? My voice sounded strange to my own ears. The truth is that Matteo never broke off his engagement to Isabella, he just postponed it. Their wedding is scheduled for 6 months after yours. Rosa slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents, legal documents, a prenuptial agreement between Matteo Duca and Isabella Martinelli, dated just 2 weeks ago. He is using you, Rosa continued, her voice breaking. Isabella's family demanded proof of his loyalty before they would agree to the alliance, proof that he was not serious about you. So he is going to marry you, divorce you within a year, and marry Isabella. You were never supposed to be anything but a pawn, a placeholder, a way to buy time while he sorted out the details of his real future. The world tilted beneath my feet. I gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling. I thought of every kiss, every whispered promise, every time he had looked at me like I was his everything. I thought of the way he had held me after the kidnapping, the desperation in his voice when he begged me to marry him. I thought of the nursery we had already started planning, painted in soft yellow because we did not know yet whether we would have a son or a daughter. Had it all been a lie? Had I been nothing but a convenient stepping stone to the woman he truly wanted? Had every touch, every tender word, every moment of connection been calculated to deceive me? I drove back to Westchester in a daze. The streets blurred past my window, but I saw none of them. All I could see were those documents, those signatures, that date, 2 weeks ago. While I had been planning our wedding, while I had been dreaming of our future together, he had been signing papers with another woman's name on them. I drove back to Westchester in a daze. Matteo was in his office when I walked in, and the smile that crossed his face when he saw me shattered what remained of my heart. "Julia," he said, standing to greet me, "I thought you were at your fitting." I threw the folder on his desk. "Explain this." His face went pale as he looked at the documents. "Where did you get these? Is it true?" I demanded. "Are you planning to divorce me and marry Isabella?" The silence that followed was the longest of my life. "Julia," he finally said, "it is not what you think." "Then what is it? Tell me the truth, Matteo. For once in your life, tell me the truth." He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I had never seen from him before. He looked suddenly younger, more vulnerable. "The engagement contract was my father's arrangement, made before he died. I have been trying to find a way out of it for years. These documents, they were a stalling tactic, a way to keep the Martinellis satisfied while I figured out how to end it for good. And you never thought to tell me?" "I was afraid." His voice broke on the word. "I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you would leave. And I could not bear the thought of losing you." I stared at this man who had become my whole world, and I realized I had a choice to make. The same choice I had made in that restaurant, in that alley, on that fire escape. I could believe the worst. I could run away and never look back, or I could trust my heart. "Do you love her?" I asked quietly. "Isabella?" "No." He crossed to me in 2 steps, taking my hands in his. "I have never loved her. I have never loved anyone the way I love you, Julia. You are not a pawn. You are not a stepping stone. You are everything. Everything. The prenup, the engagement, the alliance. I will burn it all to the ground if that is what it takes to prove myself to you." "Then prove it," I said. "End it. Now. Tonight. Before our wedding. I want to know, beyond any doubt, that when you stand at that altar, it is because you chose me. Only me." The determination that hardened his features was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "Done," he said, and he kept his word. The confrontation with the Martinellis happened that very night. I was not there, but I heard about it later. How Matteo had walked into their compound alone, unarmed, and told them the alliance was off. How Isabella had screamed and thrown things. How her father had threatened war, and how Matteo had simply said, "Then bring it, because nothing you can do to me will be worse than losing her." They did not bring war. Instead, they chose a cold peace, retreating from Duca territory and nursing their wounded pride. Rosa, who had tried to destroy us with the truth, was quietly removed from the family. I never asked what happened to her. Some things were better left unknown. 6 months after that night, I was standing at the altar of St. Anthony's Church in Little Italy. I wore my grandmother's wedding dress, which had been stored away carefully in tissue paper for 60 long years. The lace had turned a pale yellow from age, and the style was decades old, but I would not have chosen any other gown. It felt like my Nana's blessing from beyond, her way of showing approval for a marriage she seemed to have known would happen all along. The pews were filled with people from 2 entirely separate worlds. There were Matteo's associates, looking sharp in their costly suits, and then there were my classmates from the local community college. I saw elderly Italian women who had known my grandmother, women who recalled the Romano name from tales their own mothers had once shared. Father Joseph, the same priest who had baptized me when I was just a baby, stood at the front of the church. He wore a smile that made me think he also felt the historical importance of this day finally coming to pass. And then there was Matteo. He was waiting before the altar in a suit that I am sure cost more than a brand new car. His hair was slicked back in that timeless way. A gold chain around his neck glinted in the candlelight. But it was the look on his face that truly took my breath away. The undisguised love I saw in his eyes, the slight tremble in his hands as he reached out to take mine, the way his voice caught and broke when he began to speak the vows that would forever join our lives. I, Matteo Duca, take you, Giulia Romano, as my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. The words were traditional, exactly what everyone expected, but the ones he spoke next were entirely his own. I swear to you, before God and before our families, that I will use every last breath in my body to protect you. I will love you with a love that rises above the sins of my past and the dangers that wait in my future. You are the light that cuts through my darkness, the calm that settles my chaos, and the very reason I fight so hard to be a better man. His voice lowered, becoming an intimate whisper meant only for me, even in that packed church. Our grandmothers made a promise to stand by each other until the end. Today, I am making that very same promise to you, their granddaughter, their living legacy. Per sempre. Tears streamed down my own face as I recited the vows I had prepared. I had written the words in the quiet, early hours of the morning when I could not find sleep. I, Giulia Romano, take you, Matteo Duca, as my husband. I am not the naive girl who accidentally fell into your world. I come to you as a woman who has witnessed your darkness and your light, and I choose them both. I understand what you are. I understand what it means to love you, and I choose it all the same, freely and completely, with every single part of myself. I squeezed his hands tightly, feeling the solid strength in his fingers, the dependable steadiness that had become my safe harbor. My grandmother always taught me that love is an act of true courage. Today, I am proving that she was right. When Father Joseph declared us husband and wife, the applause that erupted in the church felt like it was finally closing a circle that had been left open for 3 entire generations. Matteo kissed me with the same gentle care he had shown me that very first night on my fire escape, and with the same intense passion he had unleashed in the warehouse when he believed he was about to lose me forever. In that moment, something ancient and something brand new was sealed between us. The first year of our marriage tested us in ways I never imagined. There was the constant threat from the Martinellis, who had not forgotten their humiliation. Isabella's father made it his personal mission to destroy everything Matteo had built. Business deals fell through at the last minute. Allies suddenly became enemies. There were whispers everywhere we went, rumors planted like poison seeds designed to tear us apart. Some nights I would lie awake, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake, wondering if Isabella had been right all along, if I was just a broken bird Matteo had tried to fix. Those were the hardest moments, the ones when doubt crept in like smoke under a door, filling every corner of my mind with shadows. But then Matteo would reach for me in his sleep, pulling me close even in his unconscious state, and I would remember why I had chosen this life, why I had chosen him. There was the challenge of building my bakery while learning to navigate Matteo's world. I had to learn which families were safe to be seen with, and which ones would report my every move back to our enemies. I had to learn the subtle language of power, the way a glance could convey a threat, or a lifted glass could signal an alliance. I had to transform myself from an invisible waitress into someone worthy of the Duca name. There were nights when he came home covered in blood that was not his own, and mornings when I wondered if I had made the worst mistake of my life. There were phone calls in the middle of the night that sent him racing out the door, and days when I did not see him at all. There were moments when I questioned everything, when I looked in the mirror and wondered who I had become. But there were also moments of such profound joy that they made every hardship worth it. The first time he told me he loved me in Italian, his voice rough with emotion. The afternoon he showed up at my bakery with flowers, just because he missed me. The night he held me as I cried about my grandmother, whispering stories about her that even I had never heard. Spring announced its arrival with cherry blossoms and a wave of morning sickness. I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday, standing inside the bathroom at Romano's while clutching a positive test in my shaking hands. When I told Matteo that evening, he dropped to his knees and pressed his forehead against my still flat stomach, whispering words in Italian that I was far too emotional to even try to translate. His broad shoulders shook with sobs that he made no attempt to conceal. But fate was not done testing us. Not yet. Just when I thought we had finally found our happy ending, just when I had started to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could have a normal life, everything came crashing down again. The attack came 6 weeks before my due date. Matteo was ambushed on his way home from a meeting. 6 men, all armed, all waiting for him at an intersection he drove through every day. They knew his route. They knew his schedule. They knew exactly where he would be and when. It was an inside job. Someone close to us had betrayed us. Someone we trusted. I received the call at 2 in the morning. The phone rang in the darkness, and I knew before I answered that something terrible had happened. You know that feeling? When your body understands something before your mind catches up? That was how I felt in that moment. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely answer. My husband was in emergency surgery, multiple gunshot wounds, massive blood loss. They did not know if he would survive the night. I do not remember driving to the hospital. I do not remember anything except the fear, the all-consuming terror that I was about to lose everything. I was 7 months pregnant with his child, and I was about to become a widow before I even had a chance to become a mother. I spent 3 days in that hospital, barely eating, barely sleeping, talking to his unconscious form about everything and nothing. I told him about our baby, about how she was kicking more every day, as if she knew something was wrong and was trying to tell me to stay strong. I told him about my plans for the bakery, about the new recipes I wanted to try, about the expansion I had been dreaming of. I told him about our future, about the life we were going to build together, about all the things we had not yet had the chance to experience. And I told him how angry I would be if he died and left me to raise our daughter alone. How I would never forgive him. How I would find a way to follow him to the afterlife just so I could yell at him for breaking his promise. I promised I would always come back for you, I reminded him, holding his hand while the machines beeped their steady rhythm around us. You promised. And a duca always keeps his promises. So you need to wake up, Matteo. You need to come back to me. Because I am not ready to say goodbye. I will never be ready to say goodbye. On the third day, when I had almost given up hope, his eyes finally opened. Julia, he whispered, his voice incredibly hoarse from the breathing tube that they had just taken out. The baby? Fine, I managed to say, as tears streamed down my cheeks. We are both fine. It is you that we are worried about. He squeezed my hand with a surprising amount of strength. I promised I would always come back for you. Not even death can break that promise. Matteo returned home 6 weeks before my due date. He was thinner and far weaker than I had ever seen him, walking with a cane like an old man, his once powerful body reduced to a shadow of itself. But he was alive. Every time I looked at him, I had to remind myself of that simple miracle. He was alive. The men who had orchestrated the attack on him were handled in ways I never inquired about. I learned later that it had been a coalition of our enemies, led by a man who had once called himself Matteo's friend. A man who had sat at our wedding reception and toasted to our happiness. A man who had smiled at me and told me how lucky Matteo was to have found me. His betrayal hurt almost as much as the attack itself. But in Matteo's world, betrayal was met with consequences. Their entire operation was absorbed into the Duca holdings. Their families were presented with a simple choice between demonstrating loyalty or facing complete extinction. It was brutal. It was ruthless. It was necessary. I had learned to accept this part of our life, the violence that lurked beneath the surface of everything we had built, the knowledge that my husband was capable of terrible things, the understanding that love, in our world, sometimes required blood. I really thought I was going to lose you, I confessed one night, curled up against his recovering form. I thought our daughter would grow up without ever knowing her father. Daughter? His eyebrows lifted in surprise. You found out? I smiled and pressed his hand against my belly, where our child was in the middle of her nightly acrobatic routine. The doctors informed me last week. I wanted to wait until you were strong enough to handle the news. I took a breath, summoning my courage. I want her name to be Katerina, after my grandmother. The tears that instantly welled up in his eyes were all the answer I needed. Katerina Lucia Duca, he said, his voice thick with emotion. For both of them. For the women who loved one another across generations and across continents. For the promise that they made, which ultimately brought us to this moment. Our daughter made her entrance on a beautiful spring morning, screaming with displeasure at having been removed from her warm and comfortable home. She had dark hair and light eyes, a perfect mix of the Romano and Duca bloodlines. Matteo held her with the exact same reverence he had shown me on our wedding day. His famously dangerous hands were impossibly gentle as they cradled her tiny body, and his eyes were filled with a love so fierce it seemed to completely transform him. Per sempre, he whispered to her, the promise now passing on to a new generation. Fino alla fine, forever together, until the very end. And in that moment, watching him hold our daughter, I understood why my grandmother never told me about the Ducas. She wasn't keeping secrets. She was protecting a love so precious, so sacred, that she couldn't bear to speak it aloud. She was waiting for the day when fate would bring our families together again. Waiting for me. I looked at them, my husband and my daughter, my improbable, impossible little family, and I finally grasped what my grandmother had been trying to show me all those years ago. Love was not about safety. It was not rational or convenient or in any way easy. It was a conscious choice that you made again and again, in the face of constant danger, crippling doubt, and a darkness that always threatened to swallow everything whole. But it was absolutely worth it. Every single risk, every single fear, every single moment of profound uncertainty, it was all worth it for this, for them, for us. The saga of the Romanos and Ducas had started in Naples. It had endured war, separation, and entire generations of silence. And now, it was continuing in a nursery painted a soft shade of yellow, where a mafia boss quietly sang Italian lullabies to his newborn daughter, while his wife stood watching from the doorway, her heart more full than she had ever thought possible. Some kinds of love truly were too powerful to ever be broken, and ours was definitely one of them. I used to believe that love was something that happened to you, that you fell into it like falling into water, helpless and without choice. But I was wrong. Love is not something that happens to you. Love is something you choose. Every single day. In the small moments and the terrifying ones. In the quiet mornings and the sleepless nights. You choose it when it's easy, and you choose it when it feels impossible. My grandmother chose it when she left everything she knew and came to a strange country with nothing but a jewelry box and a dream. Lucia Duca chose it when she walked away from her family's fortune to spend her final years with the woman she loved. And I chose it when I wrote 5 words on my palm and changed the course of my destiny forever. If you're still listening, I want you to know something. Whatever you're going through right now, whatever impossible situation you're facing, whatever fear is keeping you frozen in place, you have more courage inside you than you know. Sometimes all it takes is one moment, one decision, one act of bravery that changes everything. Don't wait for someone to save you. Be the person who saves yourself. And maybe, just maybe, you'll save someone else along the way. If this story touched your heart, please remember to like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to believe in the power of love. Tell them that it's never too late to take a chance. Tell them that one moment of courage can change everything. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another moment. Thank you for listening until the very end. Your support means everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful stories and valuable life lessons. Thank you for listening until the end.